Thanks, Penny, and thanks for organising this really interesting meeting. I know it was quite a lot of work, and thanks to SEB for hosting it. So I'm going to talk about sentience in fishes, and excuse the mugshot, I didn't think I would be on camera. So I'll talk about why sentience is important, and we've heard a lot about that today from various speakers, and then talk about the empirical evidence for fishes, and finally think a bit about what are the implications for the way that we use fishes if we decide that they are sentient and capable of pain perception. Well, of course, we've heard a lot today, and in particular, governments, public bodies, regulatory bodies, use sentience as a means of deciding which animals they will protect under legislation or guidelines. So showing an animal sentient is particularly important. And that's one of the key questions. Is the animal a sentient being? And so we should be affording it protection under law or under guidelines. Sadly, as you've heard already, we tend to focus on the negative aspects of animal welfare. And really an important question is, do these animals suffer in the conditions that we keep them in? And so when you go and talk to governments or regulatory bodies or public organizations, and I've spoken to these sorts of organizations across Europe and Canada, America and China, they want to know, do these animals actually suffer? So we tend to focus on whether they are capable of experiencing pain. But I do agree we need to be looking more into the idea that animals want to be in good welfare, and what are the things that they actually want in the environment, and how can we study what is good welfare. And we've also heard Jeremy Bentham's very famous quote, the question is not can they reason, nor can they talk. So it's not that they're really clever or that they can communicate directly with us. The question is, can they suffer? So if you put them in a situation which causes fear or distress or pain, do they actually suffer from that situation? There's another quote from Jeremy Bentham, which is not as quoted by others, and that's this one, which is create all the happiness you're able to create and remove all the misery you are able to remove. And I think that's quite important for us as experimental scientists, that we think about how we can create an environment for our animals where they are content and in good welfare, and how can we remove any negative events or procedures or husbandry routines. Can we remove those to improve welfare? Of course, the public's very interested in animal welfare at the moment, and in particular, you see a lot of animal rights campaigns. So, for example, this is the People for Ethical Treatment of Animals, and they had quite an important campaign looking at trying to get angling, catching fish banned. And of course, you wouldn't do that to a dog, and it does make an important point. And then I'm now in Gothenburg, and I was out on a Saturday afternoon and saw this animal rights campaign. And so you can see that their opinion is that fish do feel pain. Now, animal rights believe that we have no right to use animals in any context, and I have sympathy for that. However, I'm an animal welfare scientist, and I believe we have the right to use animals, but we should do so as humanely as possible. And so, in effect, what we see here is that animal welfare research can influence public opinion, and we are paid by the public, and the public demand that we keep animals in better condition. Of course, it's good for us in terms of science. We have quite a complicated relationship with fishes, and I think we view them in terms of the way that we use them. So, for example, we farm a lot of fish, we catch them in large-scale fisheries, we catch huge numbers, it's estimated 1 trillion fish per year. And so you may see fishes as a foodstuff, and of course, then you want them to be healthy and in good welfare. No one wants to eat sick animals. Some people like going out and catching fish as a hobby or as a sport, and of course, again, we're catching the animal using a hook, and that may cause tissue damage, which give rise to pain, and also when you get them out of the water, they're suffocating. Fishes are actually the most populous pet in terms of numbers, but they're the third most popular behind dogs and cats. And we also keep fishes and pay a lot of money to see them in public aquariums. And so again, we want the fishes to be in good health and welfare. And then finally, as a scientist, I want to use healthy animals in my experiments so that my results are robust and valid, and I can draw conclusions from them, and that the research is repeatable. And so it's a no-brainer for me that any context that we use fish in, we should be keeping them in good welfare. In terms of experimentation, of course, we do a lot of things to animals during experiments where we do cause tissue damage, and that might give rise to pain, or we put them in a stressful or fearful situation. And of course, there are quite a lot of regulations. So, for example, the National Academies of Science in the USA does have guidance on recognizing and alleviating pain in animals, and fishes are in there. I worked with the European Committee on Vaccines, and of course, they also adopt the position that we should be ensuring good welfare and doing ethical science and applying the 3 R's: replacement, reduction, and refinement. And of course, the EC directive in Europe, and of course, sadly, the UK is no longer part of Europe, but the Animal Scientific Procedure Act suggests that fish in experimentation should be treated in the same way as mammals. However, that's not always routine. And so let's move on to defining sentience. And as an empirical scientist, I want lots of things to measure. So I'm going to go into quite a lot of detail about defining sentience. And I refer to Don Broom's excellent book, Sentience and Animal Welfare. And I also interpret what Don suggested was the criteria for being sentient. So Don suggests that a sentient being has some ability. So not complete ability, and their sentience or their capacities are not going to be similar to ours or to other mammals, but sentient beings should have some ability to evaluate the actions of other animals in relation to itself and to third parties. And I would interpret that as being able to form relationships between and within species. And we heard about cognitive ability today. So the animal should have learning and memory and should show some form of intelligence in terms of learning something and then being able to remember it. The animal should also be able to assess the risks and benefits of its situation. So it should be able to make decisions and particularly base them on any risks and benefits of the situation. And we've heard a lot about feelings. So, for example, positive feelings or a positive, negative, affective state is very important for good welfare, but we should avoid negative affective states. And we can also say, is there any impact of another state on that animal? And then finally, have some degree of awareness. And we could say that's some sort of primary consciousness where the animal has a sense of I and how I relate to the world. And so we can design experiments to test each of these criteria. And there is a famous quote from Reddo and Bashari, which says, behaviorally speaking, you can find a fish that can do anything a mammal can do, and yet we don't always treat fishes in the same way that we treat mammals. So I'm going to go through some examples very briefly, just to show you that fishes do fulfill these criteria for sentience. So, for example, do they form relationships within species? And these are rabbit fishes, and they live in coral reefs, and you can see here they live in pairs. And while one fish is being vigilant and looking for predators, the other fish is feeding and penetrating deep into the coral crevices to get food. And they precisely match each other's behavior, and this requires quite a high cognitive ability to be able to interpret your partner's intentions and behavior and precisely match your intentions and behavior with that. And that kind of very elegant relationship is called direct reciprocity, and that's where you equally match each other's behavior for the benefit of both. And only a handful of mammals and birds show this direct reciprocity. So this is a very important behavior in terms of deciding if animals are sentient. And here's just a video. I hope it's playing okay. What you can see is one fish is being vigilant while the other eats in the crevices, and then they will change roles. And there is a benefit, of course. The fish take more bites and penetrate deeper into the crevices. Another benefit, of course, you can see here the fishes are being vigilant, they scatter, and of course a predator arrives. And so that means the animals survive better. Now, what about relationships between species? And I'm sure many of you have seen the grouper and moray eel hunting together. So the grouper comes and shakes its head over the moray eel burrow, and in effect signals to that species, would you like to come hunting with me? And what you can see here is the grouper swimming off with the moray eel. You can see the tail here, and effectively they do go off hunting together. And the grouper is pointing here and head shaking, and it's signaling to the moray eel, can you go in this crevice, I can't get into it, and chase the prey out. And of course, again, the benefits are that they in effect get more food hunting together than not. So again, there's a good benefit of having a relationship between species. Now, the next example is, of course, learning and memory, or cognitive ability. And of course, the myth that the goldfish has a 3-second memory, but actually they're incredibly clever. And this cheesy video shows you what they can do.
Until now.
Apologies for the awful music, but that shows you they can train fish. And actually had a colleague who worked on goldfish and showed that they could remember for up to 3 years. And what we have here is a very complicated, or so-called complicated behavior, which is tool use. So these tusk fish feed on these bivalves, which are very hard to get into. And so what you'll see here is a tusk fish finding a bivalve, a prey item. And once it finds it, it swims off to find a rock. And if I just fast forward the video, the tusk fish now uses this rock to basically crack open that mollusk. So there it is, it's banging the mollusk against the rock there. So that is indeed tool use. Here's another example. This is the archfish, and it spits at insect prey, and that requires a huge amount of computation and cognitive ability. And this study effectively showed that archfish could learn up to 44 different faces with 93% accuracy. So the archfish spat at a face, and if it spat at the right one, it got a reward. And even when you tilt the faces to a different orientation, the archfish picked the correct face. So here is a video of the wondrous archfish. So it spits at the correct face, and then the archfish then gets a reward. Now, our fish is able to take risks or assess the benefits of their behavior. Here we have the cleaner fish, and these wrasse are very well studied in terms of their intelligence and what they can do. And I'm sure you know they form cleaning stations on coral reefs, and client fish predators come in and have parasites effectively cleaned off. However, the skin and mucus of the clients is much more nutritious. So sometimes the cleaner won't bite the client. So what will it do if it's being watched? So in this study, they had an invisible bystander and then one that was visible. When they couldn't see they were being watched, they took more bites than if they could. And essentially, they knew they had an audience, and they knew that this audience could be a potential new client. And so that shows you they assess the risks and benefits of that situation. And then we have positive feelings. This is quite difficult to study, but in this particular piece of research, Suarez and colleagues effectively had a cleaner fish with brushes on it, and they had a surgeon fish, and the cleaner fish model was moved back and forward. And what you can see here is that the surgeon fish orientates itself and actually gets a massage from these brushes. And when Suarez and colleagues took plasma samples from these fish, they actually had much lower stress levels after the massage. So much like us after a nice day at the spa, we feel calmer. But of course, negative feelings, and I've spent the last 22 years working on pain, fear, and distress in fishes, and what I can tell you is they have nociceptors, they have brain responses, analgesics prevent all of these. And this video shows you a rainbow trout feeding on a gammarus with a smooth bag. And you can see the hungry trout eats it pretty quickly. But then we test gammarus with a spiny bag. So it has spines. If you bite down, that might be painful. So you can see the trout is having quite a lot of trouble with this. And eventually the hungry trout does eat it. And the next example, we have a spined species. So we can see the trout goes in. In that case, the trout leaves the gammarus. It doesn't go back to actually feed on it. Here's another example. We have a pair of zebrafish in a tank, and I've spent quite a lot of time profiling their behavior. And what you can see is control behavior. The fish swim around constantly. They use all of the tank. They interact with each other. And then if you take one of these fish and you fin clip it, where you anesthetize it, you remove the tail fin, and then you perform genomic screening on that. Now that's done under anesthesia, but analgesia is not routinely given. Here we have a fish which has been fin clipped, and as you can see, it's very immobile. It's sitting on the bottom of the tank. It's not swimming around. It's not interacting with the other fish, and so you can see there's quite a dramatic change in behavior there. And so there is a significant amount of evidence for pain in fishes, and not just from my laboratory. Laboratories across the world are showing the same results. So what about negative feelings affecting another fish? And in this study, they looked at fear contagion. Now, we might think of this in human terms as empathy. So when you see someone sad, you feel sad, or when you see someone happy, you feel happier. We call this contagion in animals, and in this particular study on zebrafish, they looked at fear contagion. And so what they did was they had demonstrator fish in a tank, and they were either given water as a stimulus or alarm substance. An alarm substance is a predator cue which causes freezing behavior. So we can see the amount of freezing before anything was done in the demonstrators, and then after water, and this green circle, we see there's no change in freezing. However, after alarm substance, we get quite a significant increase in freezing. However, these were being observed by other fish. Now, these observers did not get the alarm substance. And so their behavior is changed just by watching the demonstrator. So you can see the water has no effect when water is added to the demonstrator. However, when they watch the demonstrator increasing in freezing, we see that they increase in freezing. And it doesn't matter whether the demonstrator is familiar to them or unfamiliar. So that shows that there's a contagion of fear. Now, finally, we want to know, are the animals conscious? And of course, we've heard about the mirror recognition test today, and it's supposed to be the gold standard. If an animal can pass this test, then it is conscious and it can recognize itself. And again, we've got our friend, the cleaner wrasse. And in effect, a mirror was presented to cleaner wrasse, and then they added a red dot onto the throat. And then they saw that the animal actually tried to rub the red dot on. So that suggests that it recognizes itself in the mirror, it recognizes there's something on itself, and it tries to get rid of it. And we can see the behavior here in this video. So often when you present a mirror to fish, they see it as a conspecific, a competitor, so they'll perform aggressive behaviors. But after a while, they'll realize it's not, and they perform strange mirror-directed behaviors. So here we have upside-down swimming. And then, of course, when you add the red dot, we see that the fish actually scrapes the throat on the substrate and we believe in an attempt to get rid of the red dot. Now, of course, that study's been criticised, and the authors made a very clear point that if it was an elephant waving its trunk at the mirror, everybody would be like, yes, of course, elephants are sentient beings and conscious. And when it's a fish, they're subject to what's called speciesism, and people then start saying, well, what does the mirror recognition test really show us? But I hope I've shown you from all of that evidence that a sentient being has some ability to do all these things, and actually we can tick all these boxes for fishes. I've only touched on a very small number of examples, and Cullen Brown and I wrote a book chapter. We don't get paid for this, but if you're interested in reading more about the wonders of fish and how they're sentient, there's many more examples in this book chapter. So what are the implications for welfare if we accept that fish are sentient beings and they can suffer? Well, of course, we use them as a foodstuff, and we farm them in high numbers and catch them in high numbers. This is a video still taken from an Atlantic salmon farm in Scotland, and you can see a lot of the skin is missing, and they're infested with salmon lice. Now, if you saw a cow or a pig in a field and it was covered in parasites and bits of skin missing, there would be a public outcry. And yet, this is what happens in salmon farming, and some of the situations and things that we do to fishes in aquaculture and fisheries just wouldn't be acceptable for mammals. Of course, we also catch fish, and obviously we cause tissue damage. So myself and colleagues have written about how can we improve the experience for the fish using barbless hooks, knotless nets. And then in terms of companion animals, there's no way that we would give a puppy or a kitten away as a prize at a fair. But of course, this does happen in certain countries, that fishes are viewed as a prize and something to give away. And then we have public aquaria, and I've worked with one public aquarium in the UK quite extensively, but they do try to keep their animals in great welfare, because if you want to buy a sand tiger shark, it's 23,000 euros, and so it's they must keep their animals in good health. And then of course one of the points of having this meeting is to think about how can we improve the welfare of our animals in experimentation. And fishes have become the second most popular experimental model across Europe, so we use more fishes than rats now. Of course, if we accept fish as sentient, experience pain, what would actually happen? And I personally hope that we would treat fishes better and we would afford them the same protection as mammals. But of course, we accept that cows, chickens and pigs are sentient and experience pain, yet we still farm them. And some would argue in intensive farming, their welfare may be compromised. I spoke to Carl Safina, who's a journalist and an incredibly keen angler. He loves catching fish. And we talked about all of the empirical evidence for pain in fish. And actually, as an angler, he sort of accepts that fish can feel pain. But what he does make the important point is that, is it too painful for us to think about? Because, then we have to change our ways. But I think as an animal welfare scientist, we can just do things much better in terms of the way that we do our experiments. And here we have Practical Fish Keeping magazine. They ran a poll for whether you believed fish are capable of pain or not. This is people who keep fish as pets, and you can see 96% of people say yes. So what can we do to refine our experiments? And I wrote a review with Kath, Ian and Ed and talked about how we can employ better techniques, how we can employ the 3 R's in fish research. So I'll give you a couple of examples to think about. This is a study by Ken Wintilly and Will Norton's lab, where they've used skin swabbing. So they actually swab the side of the zebrafish skin rather than cutting part of the tail off to get DNA. And they've proved that that actually works. Another thing to consider is if you're doing any surgery or tagging and it's invasive, when you do your experiment, are you measuring the responses to pain rather than the responses to your treatment? So can we use pain relief? Can we use analgesia to reduce pain in invasive experiments. And that's exactly what Sarah Lelick and Daniela Panikova did. And they used morphine and lidocaine after heart damage, and actually found that morphine does not affect the data. And so lidocaine actually did delay regeneration of the heart, but morphine doesn't. And so their recommendation is apply morphine in these heart damage studies. And then, of course, we do experiments on wild animals, and this is just a recently funded piece of work that I'm doing with Matt Witt, Lucy Hawkes, and Greg Paul, where we're looking at refining the tagging of pelagic fish and sharks by employing things like anesthesia and analgesia to the tags to see if we can improve the welfare of these animals. So I hope that's given you some idea of ways that you can improve your experimentation. But I hope I've shown you there is significant empirical evidence for sentience and pain of fishes, and that we can ensure good welfare by employing philosophical concepts and ethical and moral codes, and the 3 R's. I'd just like to finish by thanking everybody involved in these experiments, and also the funding bodies. Thanks, of course, to the fish for participating, and thank you very much for your attention.
Great, thank you so much, Lynne. That was incredibly interesting and helpful. I'm sure it's given everybody a lot of food for thought, and those references were very helpful too. I think what we'll do, we'll take some questions for you. We'll have our break on time. The discussion questions for breakout groups that I penciled in for before the break, I think we can take after the break, after my presentation. So we'll just use this last bit of time for questions for you, because I'm sure there'll be a lot of them, and they're coming in already. Can you see the first question in the chat box from Anna Valentin?
Yeah, so thanks, Anna. So in the fear contagion experiment, yeah, it could be that they're scared something's going to happen to them. They see a conspecific in the next tank freezing, and so it could be that they're just freezing because they think, well, this is the appropriate thing to do. I detect that there's risk in the environment. So instead of it being contagion or empathy, it might just be that they're responding to behaviorally. And so what we have to do then is try and get the mechanisms, and that's something I've just got a PhD student started on, which is actually what's actually happening inside the fish. Are we seeing a change in the brain areas that are involved in emotional behavior and responses to predator cues, or is it just merely just a behavioral change, and there's not actually a lot going on? There's no stress response. So that's something we really need to investigate in much more detail.
Okay, thank you. And there's a question from Jonathan.
Yes, so is the fourth condition, having feelings from Don's list, a fundamental one? I think all of those were fundamental in terms of Don's opinion on defining sentience, that animals should have some ability to fulfill all of those criteria. Of course, I always do it with a caveat. If there's no evidence, it might mean that the experiments haven't been done yet. And so there is an absence of evidence, and of course the cliche, that does not mean there is an absence of sentience, but certainly in Don's book, he covers all of those criteria, and he thinks all of those are equally important. And I know today we've seen that most people define sentience and focus on the positive and negative feelings and whether that matters to the animal, but I think there are other aspects of sentience which I think are important evidence to show the public, the government, bodies, to evidence sentience in these animals, that they are intelligent beings.
Thanks. Have we got any more questions? You can either pop up and ask them verbally or type them into the chat box. I've got one, actually. A lot of this research and a lot of the examples that we see tend to focus on teleost fish, and it seems that elasmobranchs get kind of left out of the picture a bit, particularly with phenomena like nociception and pain and learning and all the rest of it. Is there any welfare research ongoing for elasmobranchs? Do you think they're the same or different to other fishes?
Sure. Cullen Brown has been doing a lot of research on intelligence and social behaviour in elasmobranchs, and have to be honest, he and I have tried to get funding for exploring nociception and pain in a variety of species, and sad to say that we've been unlucky so far. But yeah, there is a dearth of information on elasmobranchs. There are a few quite old studies where they did some neuroanatomy and showed that there's a lack of C fibers, which is an unmyelinated neuron which acts as a nociceptor in teleost fishes and, of course, other vertebrates. But in fishes, A delta fibers actually act as C fibers in terms of their functional physiology. And so really there is just a lack of information, and I think it is partly due to a lack of funding and partly because elasmobranchs are not as amenable to keep in the laboratory as many other species. I think, you know, in terms of us, we'd only work on dogfishes really, but it's certainly an area that really needs funding and really needs more work. Certainly because, of course, you see all the horrible videos of sharks being finned and thrown back alive, and it's just really unacceptable to do that. But yeah, it's sadly there is a lack of information in elasmobranchs.
Yeah. Okay. Have we got any more questions? So either chat box or pop up, or any comments from fish users? I know that a lot of SEB members use fish. Has anybody had any thoughts on refinement or enrichment as an outcome of Lynne's talk? I think the work looking at swabbing instead of fin clipping for genotyping is particularly important, isn't it? That's certainly something that we're going to be pushing and promoting and getting out there.
Yeah, certainly, and I think it's a really great way of preventing what is a painful treatment to the animal, and you don't have to anaesthetize them, which is stressful, and you know, then you're not causing them pain. They seem to recover completely normally, and they've done a whole battery of tests looking at health measures and showing that the fish are healthy afterwards. So in effect, it's a wonderful replacement of quite an invasive procedure.
Yeah. So, comment from Anna again, especially important. There's the myth that sharks cannot feel pain. Yes, that was partly why I asked you the question that I did, because I can remember being told that at the meeting and feeling that was a very dangerous assumption to make. And Catherine's thanking you for the link for the morphine and regeneration work. So yeah, that's what this is all about. Another comment there from Lola. Oh, was that a question from Lola actually? How has developments in eDNA in the fish world helped?
Yeah, so eDNA is when you take a sample from the surrounding water and screen it for the species that are actually in the water. And I haven't worked on that myself, but I know there was some researchers came to the public aquarium I was working with and were sampling their main tank, which had a range of shark species and teleost fishes, and were trying to see if they could actually identify specific shark species for conservation purposes. And so it's a wonderful way of you know, you're not even having to handle the fish. If you can extract enough DNA from the environment, then you don't even need to touch the fish, which, you know, is a real refinement. So yeah, it's a very interesting technique. Hopefully it'll be developed in the future for laboratory use.
Yeah. Oh, another question from Nikolai Lindeborg.
Hi, Nikolai. Yeah, so I did an interview for Practical Fish Keeping magazine, which is for people who keep fish. It's UK based, and that was their Facebook page where they ran a survey. And so, yeah, I find when I talk to the public that the majority, if not all, people say, yes, of course, fish feel pain. And for me, it makes sense because, of course, you know, if fish didn't, they just go around hurting themselves all the time and having big injuries and probably dying. And of course, pain is an alarm system in many ways, and I think that's why it's so conserved across evolution. But yeah, so people who keep fish, 96% of them think, yeah, they do experience pain.
And there's a question there about pain in crustaceans, and I wonder if Jonathan's still with us. He might like to take that one. Are you still there?
I'm still here, yeah.
You can put your camera on now as well if you want to.
I could do.
We'll just
so the question is simply any idea on pain in crustaceans. I guess the questioner's intention was to ask Lynne what she thinks, because I said what I think earlier, which is that we should be taking stronger steps to...
Or maybe they weren't here earlier.
I get increasingly asked to talk about pain in crustaceans, and there is substantial evidence now. There's a lot of different studies on gamma-ris and electric shock. There's a lot of Bob Elwood's work out there already, but other labs are now showing similar results, that there is the capacity for pain in crustaceans. There are some parts of the sort of criteria for animal pain that are missing, but again, it's because the experiments haven't been done yet. So yeah, I would say there is sufficient evidence to say that we're beyond a reasonable doubt that crustaceans experience pain.
It's a good case where precautionary thinking seems extremely appropriate.
Yeah, and then hope I've got a bit more to say about that after the break as well. Right, we've got some more. We're due for a break, so shall we just? Anna's commented in Switzerland. I think it's no longer legal to boil lobster. Yes, that is correct, quite rightly.
And New Zealand.
Yeah. So we've got a couple more questions about. Should we just take? If we just take one more, and then I think we better have our break. What would be the best way to diagnose pain outside an experimental setting, e.g. in it's moved in husbandry, I think?
Yeah. Well, Niels, the easy solution is to watch the behavior of the fishes, and certainly the results that we've shown. So, for example, zebrafish sink to the bottom of the tank; they're very immobile. We've shown that rainbow trout, again, don't move very much, much less activity, and they don't feed during pain. But that's also an indicator of stress. So I guess if the animal's been damaged in any way and it's showing behavioral changes from normal, and it's not feeding, then what that would suggest is possibly pain. So that would be the easiest thing. However, there's very few species been tested, and there are species-specific differences. So, for example, Nile tilapia become more active after fin clipping. So, you know, it really depends on the species that you're looking at. So I think the main take-home message would be, is there a change from normal, and is there some sort of injury or problem that's occurred?
Great. Thank you very much. So what we'll do now, we'll take a break for 10 minutes as set out in the agenda, and then I'll just shuffle things around a bit. So when we come back, I'll give you the presentation on ethical and welfare implications. I've just got a few slides. It'll last about 10 minutes, and then we can have a wrap up and just assimilate all that we've heard today and think about some take-home messages from all of that. So we'll have a break, but first of all, thank you so much to Lynne and Catherine for 2 more fantastic talks.